Something profound is happening in our world that most people haven't noticed yet. The most spiritually aware, psychologically developed individuals are quietly vanishing from mainstream society. Not dramatically, not with grand announcements or manifestos. They're simply fading away, retreating from careers, reducing social media presence, ending relationships, and choosing solitude over the collective noise that passes for normal life. Carl Jung predicted this exodus decades ago. He understood that when someone reaches a certain level of spiritual awakening, participating in mass unconsciousness becomes not just uncomfortable but emotionally unbearable. What we're witnessing isn't a trend or a phase. It's the inevitable result of inner awareness expanding in a world that often runs on distraction and conformity. If you've been feeling the pull to withdraw, to step back from society's games, to disappear into the margins, Jung would tell you something that might surprise you. You're not antisocial, you're not depressed, you're not failing at life. You're becoming too conscious for the unconscious container that society provides. And this withdrawal isn't weakness. It's a stage of psychological growth and balance. Today I'm going to reveal Jung's theoretical warning about why the spiritually awake are disappearing and what this means for both the individuals vanishing and the society they're leaving behind. Because once you understand the psychological forces at play, you'll see that this quiet exodus isn't random. It's archetypal, it's necessary. And it might be exactly what our world needs. Jung spent his entire career studying what he called the spiritual problem of modern humanity. He noticed that people in Western society were suffering from feelings of hopelessness, insignificance, and inadequacy on a massive scale. But this wasn't just individual pathology. It was a collective crisis rooted in something deeper. Modern society, Jung observed, systematically undermines individual authenticity. We live in a world designed to create uniformity, where people feel overshadowed and outcast if they don't conform to collective expectations. Every magazine you open, every program you watch, every social media feed you scroll through is engineered to make you feel inadequate unless you buy into the collective dream. Companies influence your emotions to sell products. Politicians appeal to your fears to gain compliance. Social media leverages human attention to keep you engaged. The entire system depends on keeping people disconnected from self-awareness and seeking external validation. But something remarkable happens when someone begins to awaken spiritually. They start seeing through these manipulations, the things that once motivated them, the goals they once pursued, the relationships they once valued. All begin to feel hollow, meaningless, even toxic. And this creates an unbearable tension between who they're becoming and the world they're expected to inhabit. Jung called this the nigredo, or blackening phase of transformation. A period when your old self has died but your new self hasn't fully emerged. You're caught between worlds, no longer able to participate unconsciously in society's games, but not yet clear about what comes next. This isn't depression, though it might look like it. It's a transformative psychological phase. The awakening person discovers they can no longer pretend to care about things that don't matter. They can't fake enthusiasm for meaningless work. They can't engage in shallow conversations. They can't perform the social rituals that once felt natural. Every interaction becomes exhausting because it requires them to betray their expanding consciousness just to fit in. This is where the disappearing begins. Not as a conscious choice at first, but as an inner reaction to inauthenticity. The spiritually awakening person starts withdrawing from situations, relationships, and environments that require them to be less than they've become. They quit seeking approval because their inner worth no longer depends on external validation. They stop performing happiness when they're going through necessary darkness. They release their grip on certainty because they've discovered that mystery is more truthful than any fixed belief. Jung understood that this withdrawal serves a crucial purpose. He called it individuation, the process of becoming a psychologically integrated individual. But here's what most people don't realize. Individuation literally cuts you off from collective conformity. When you start thinking for yourself, feeling for yourself, being yourself, you automatically separate from the herd mentality that keeps society functioning. This separation creates what Jung described as a profound loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being awake in a world of sleepers. The individuating person sees through the collective projections, the mass delusions, the shared fantasies that everyone else takes for reality. They recognize the games being played, the roles being performed, the shadows being projected onto convenient scapegoats. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you recognize that most social conflicts are just collective shadow projections, you can't participate in the blame games anymore. Once you understand that political divisions are mass psychological projections, you can't pick sides with the same unconscious fervor. Once you see that social media outrage is just collective shadow material seeking targets, you can't engage in the mob mentality anymore. This is why the spiritually awake start disappearing from social media first. These platforms are designed to amplify unconscious material. Every scroll is an assault of projections, repressions, and shadow boxing for someone who's integrated their own shadow. Watching people attack external targets for their own unconscious material becomes unbearable. It's like being forced to watch a psychological storm unfold in real time. But the withdrawal goes deeper than just avoiding social media. The awakening person discovers they can no longer perform their persona, the social mask they once wore automatically. Before awakening, you could play the expected roles unconsciously. You could smile when expected, say the right things, perform your identity without question. But once you've touched your authentic self, going back to persona performance feels like spiritual exhaustion. Every social situation starts demanding a performance. The workplace persona, the family role, the social identity, the acceptable opinions, the appropriate emotions. For someone still identified with their persona, this feels normal. For someone who's found their authentic self, it feels like suffocation. They literally cannot force themselves to be fake anymore. Their inner self refuses to cooperate with the performance. Jung experienced this personally after his own period of inner crisis. He could no longer perform the role of the proper Swiss psychiatrist. He couldn't pretend to agree with collective opinions he saw through. He couldn't maintain relationships that required him to be false, so he withdrew to his tower at Bollingen, where he could be authentically himself without apology. This isn't antisocial behavior. It's pro-authentic behavior. The awakening person isn't rejecting society from anger or superiority. They're becoming incompatible with environments that require fakeness. They've become too real for spaces that demand performance, too authentic for containers that only accept fragments, too whole for systems designed to keep people divided. The energy required to maintain this performance becomes unsustainable. Think about what the conscious person has to do just to exist in unconscious spaces. They must constantly filter out projections, maintain boundaries against negative influences, translate between depth and surface, hold their frequency while surrounded by static, process not just their own material but everyone else's unconscious leakage. Jung called this psychological labor, the invisible work conscious people do just to survive in unconscious environments. Eventually, the awakening person realizes they have a choice. They can either preserve their consciousness by withdrawing from draining environments, or they can sacrifice their hard-won awareness to maintain social belonging. Most choose preservation over performance. They choose authenticity over acceptance. They choose their inner peace over society's approval. This choice initiates what Jung recognized as the hermit phase, an archetypal pattern that every individuating person must enter. Not permanently, but necessarily. The psyche requires solitude to integrate what society would fragment. It needs silence to hear the inner voice. It demands space from influences that would pull it back to old patterns. The hermit archetype isn't about misanthropy or social rejection. It's about psychological necessity. When you're transforming at a fundamental level, you need protection from forces that would interrupt that transformation. You need distance from collective consciousness to develop individual consciousness. You need separation from others' projections to understand your own depths. This hermit phase looks like disappearance to the outside world, but it's actually deepening. The awakening person isn't running away from responsibility. They're going deeper than society allows. They're doing work that can only be accomplished in solitude, developing consciousness that might eventually serve the collective, but only after it's fully formed. Jung himself went through profound hermit phases during his years at Bollingen. These weren't vacations or escapes. They were periods of psychological necessity where he needed distance from collective consciousness to develop the insights that would revolutionize our understanding of the human psyche. He needed separation from others' expectations to explore his own unconscious depths without interference. What's happening to spiritually awake people today follows this exact pattern. They're not abandoning the world out of selfishness or superiority. They're following an archetypal necessity that individuation demands. The hermit phase is when the shadow integrates without social pressure to repress it. When the authentic self emerges without persona demands. When inner wisdom develops without outer noise interrupting the process. But here's what makes this contemporary exodus different from individual hermit phases of the past. We're witnessing a mass inner withdrawal happening simultaneously across the globe. Millions of awakening souls are experiencing the same allergic reaction to collective unconsciousness at the same time. Social media is accelerating both the awakening process and the withdrawal response. The digital age has created unprecedented exposure to collective shadow material. Every day, awakening individuals are bombarded with unconscious projections, online hostility, and collective delusions amplified through algorithmic feedback loops. For someone who's integrated their own psychological material, this constant exposure becomes genuinely toxic. They start recognizing that most online interactions are just people projecting their unconscious material onto convenient targets. Political debates become exercises in mass projection. Social justice movements can sometimes become vehicles for emotional expression rather than resolution. Even spiritual communities may reflect similar ego patterns they seek to transcend. The awakened person sees through all of it and finds they simply cannot participate without compromising their integrity. This creates what Jung would recognize as an epidemic of spiritual disconnection. Awakening individuals discover they no longer fit anywhere in conventional society. Their old friend groups feel superficial. Their careers feel meaningless. Their families don't understand their transformation. Religious institutions feel dogmatic and rigid. Even alternative spiritual communities can operate from the same ego patterns they're trying to outgrow. The result is a growing population of conscious individuals who exist on the margins of society, connected to each other through invisible threads of understanding but largely invisible to the mainstream world. They're creating what Jung might call parallel inner structures, alternative ways of living that honor consciousness over conformity, authenticity over achievement, inner development over external success. These disappearing souls aren't becoming hermits forever. They're going through what Jung recognized as a necessary death and rebirth process. They're shedding identities, relationships, careers, and lifestyles that no longer serve their expanding consciousness. But this shedding creates a temporary void, a period of not knowing who they are or what they're supposed to do next. Jung called this the encounter with the void, a phase where the old self has dissolved but the new self hasn't yet crystallized. During this period, the individual experiences what appears to be motivational collapse. The drives that once propelled their lives suddenly vanish. Goals that once seemed important feel hollow. Ambitions that once energized them feel meaningless. This isn't laziness or depression, though it might be misdiagnosed as such. It's what Jung understood as enantiodromia, the psychological principle where things transform into their opposite. The person who was once highly motivated becomes contemplative. The achiever becomes reflective. The extrovert becomes introspective. The social butterfly becomes the hermit. Society interprets this transformation as failure, breakdown, or mental illness. Family members worry, friends feel rejected, employers lose valuable workers. But from Jung's perspective, this apparent collapse is actually a breakthrough attempting to happen. The old motivational structure based on ego drives and external validation must dissolve before a new structure based on authentic purpose can emerge. The awakening person discovers that their previous motivations were largely unconscious. They were driven by unresolved childhood wounds, cultural programming, peer pressure, fear of rejection, need for approval, or desperate attempts to prove their worth. All of these motivational sources become unavailable once consciousness expands beyond ego identification. This creates a challenging but necessary period of existential questioning. Who am I without my achievements? What do I want without social programming telling me what to want? What's my purpose without external authorities defining purpose for me? How do I live without the unconscious drives that once propelled my existence? These questions cannot be answered quickly or easily. They require what Jung called a symbolic descent into the depths of the psyche, a journey to understand what lies beneath all the conditioning, programming, and social expectations. This journey takes time, solitude, and enormous courage. During this descent, the awakening person often appears to be disappearing even more completely from society. They might quit their jobs without having new ones lined up. They might end relationships that once seemed stable. They might distance themselves from social circles that once felt important. From the outside, this looks like self-destruction. From the inside, it feels like authentic self-discovery. Jung understood that this apparent destruction is actually a creative process. The psyche is clearing away everything inauthentic to make space for what's genuinely true. It's burning down the false structures so the real foundation can be revealed. This process cannot be rushed, forced, or bypassed. It has its own timing, rhythm, and intelligence. The awakening individual must learn to trust this process even when it looks like their life is falling apart. They must develop faith in the wisdom of their own psyche even when everyone around them thinks they're making terrible choices. They must believe in their transformation even when they can't see where it's leading. This requires a fundamental shift from external validation to inner authority. The disappearing person must learn to listen to their own soul rather than society's expectations. They must develop the courage to follow their authentic path even when it leads away from conventional success, social approval, or family acceptance. Jung recognized this shift as the emergence of what he called the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to hold paradox and navigate between conscious and unconscious material without getting overwhelmed by either. This function allows the awakening person to stay connected to their depths while still functioning in the outer world, though often in completely different ways than before. But the development of this transcendent function takes time. And during its emergence, the awakening person often experiences what Jung called the dark night of the soul. This isn't clinical depression, though it shares some symptoms. It's a spiritual crisis where all meaning structures collapse simultaneously. The person finds themselves unable to care about anything that once mattered, unable to find purpose in activities that once brought satisfaction, unable to connect with people who once felt close. This dark night serves a crucial function in the individuation process. It strips away all false sources of meaning so the authentic source can reveal itself. The ego's manufactured purposes must dissolve before the soul's true purpose can emerge. But this dissolution period is excruciating because the person experiences themselves as completely lost, directionless, and disconnected from life itself. Jung observed that modern society has no framework for understanding this necessary spiritual crisis. We often misinterpret it or try to fix it with quick solutions and surface-level positivity. But these approaches miss the point entirely. The dark night cannot be solved or cured because it's not a problem. It's an initiation into a deeper way of being. The awakening person must learn to inhabit this darkness consciously, to let it strip away everything false without fighting the process. They must develop what Jung called negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainty and doubt without irritably reaching after fact and reason. This means accepting not knowing who they are, what they want, or where they're going. This acceptance of unknowing terrifies the ego, which has built its entire structure on certainty, control, and knowing. The ego experiences the dark night as a symbolic death, which it is, the death of ego dominance in the psyche. But what the ego doesn't understand is that this death makes space for something infinitely larger to emerge. Jung called this larger presence the self with a capital S, the organizing center of the total psyche that includes both conscious and unconscious material. The self has its own intelligence, its own purposes, its own timing, and it often has completely different plans than the ego ever imagined. As the self begins to emerge during the dark night, the awakening person starts receiving guidance from within rather than seeking direction from external authorities. They begin to trust their intuition over social expectations. They start making choices based on inner knowing rather than logical analysis. They develop what Jung called a reverent attitude toward their own inner process. This doesn't necessarily mean becoming religious in a conventional sense. It means developing reverence for the mystery of their own transformation. It means treating their inner life as sacred. It means recognizing that something larger than their conscious mind is orchestrating their individuation process. This shift from ego control to self-guidance creates even more incompatibility with mainstream society, which operates almost exclusively from ego consciousness. The awakening person finds they can no longer make decisions based solely on practical considerations, social expectations, or rational analysis. They must factor in subtle inner promptings, synchronicities, dreams, and intuitive guidance that most people dismiss as irrelevant. This creates what appears to be irrational behavior from society's perspective. The awakening person might turn down lucrative job offers because something feels off energetically. They might end relationships that look perfect on paper because their inner sense of alignment says otherwise. They might move to new locations without logical reasons because their inner guidance points them in that direction. Family members and friends often interpret these choices as evidence of confusion or impracticality. They don't understand that the awakening person is operating from a completely different decision-making framework. What looks like impractical idealism is actually an emerging sense of deeper psychological wisdom. Jung experienced this conflict personally when he followed his inner guidance to build his tower at Bollingen with his own hands. Despite being a successful psychiatrist with no construction experience. To his colleagues, this looked like an eccentric waste of time. To Jung, it was essential inner work that connected him to something primal and authentic within himself. The awakening person discovers that following inner guidance often leads to outcomes that couldn't have been predicted or planned by the ego. Synchronicities increase dramatically. Meaningful coincidences become everyday occurrences. The right people appear at the right moments. Opportunities emerge from unexpected directions. Resources manifest in mysterious ways. Jung called this phenomenon the transcendent function in action, the psyche's ability to create bridges between conscious intentions and unconscious possibilities. But experiencing this requires enormous trust in the invisible intelligence that orchestrates such events. The awakening person must learn to cooperate with forces they cannot see or understand. This cooperation demands a fundamental shift from trying to make life happen to allowing life to happen through them. Instead of forcing outcomes through willpower and strategy, they learn to align with the natural flow of their individuation process. Instead of pushing against obstacles, they learn to recognize what's trying to emerge and support that emergence. This shift from forcing to flowing creates another layer of incompatibility with achievement-oriented society. The awakening person can no longer participate in the relentless pursuit of goals, the aggressive competition for resources, or the desperate struggle to control outcomes. These behaviors feel not just futile but psychologically draining to their development. They discover that their previous relationship with ambition was largely unconscious, driven by unresolved wounds around worth, belonging, and survival. As these wounds heal through the individuation process, the compulsive need to achieve, acquire, and accumulate simply evaporates. What remains is a more organic relationship with creativity and contribution. But this organic relationship doesn't look like traditional success. The awakening person might become incredibly productive in ways that don't translate to conventional metrics. They might write books that few people read but that profoundly impact those who do. They might create art that doesn't sell, but that expresses something essential about the human experience. They might help individuals transform in ways that can't be quantified or publicized. Jung recognized this pattern in his own life after his break with Freud. He could have continued building his reputation through conventional academic channels, but his inner guidance led him toward exploring uncharted territories of the psyche. This exploration seemed professionally risky and personally isolating, but it ultimately produced insights that revolutionized psychology. The awakening person learns to trust that their authentic contribution will find its way into the world without forcing or marketing. They develop faith that being genuinely themselves serves the collective in ways they might never fully understand. They realize that their primary responsibility is to their own individuation process, trusting that this inner work naturally radiates outward to benefit others. This trust in the value of inner work creates yet another point of friction with productivity-obsessed culture. The awakening person spends increasing amounts of time in contemplation, reflection, creative exploration, and personal development. To external observers, this might look like inactivity or avoidance of real-world responsibilities. But Jung understood that this inner work is deeply practical in its own way. An unconscious person operates from conditioning, projections, and reactive patterns that create chaos in their personal life and contribute to collective confusion. A conscious person operates from authenticity, clarity, and responsive wisdom that creates harmony in their environment and contributes to collective healing. The awakening person gradually realizes that their withdrawal from mainstream society isn't permanent isolation but necessary preparation. They're developing psychological capacities that will eventually allow them to engage with the world from a place of consciousness rather than unconsciousness. They're learning to be in the world but not of it. This preparation phase requires them to establish new relationships with fundamental aspects of human existence. They must rediscover what work means when it's not driven by survival anxiety or ego ambition. They must relearn what relationships look like when they're based on authentic connection rather than mutual projection. They must reimagine what success means when it's measured by inner growth rather than external accumulation. These discoveries cannot be made while still embedded in unconscious social structures. The awakening person needs space and time to explore these questions without pressure to conform to existing answers. They need permission to not know, to experiment, to fail, to start over, to follow mysterious promptings that might lead nowhere obvious. Jung called this period the second half of life, though it's not necessarily determined by chronological age. It's the phase where the focus shifts from ego development to soul development, from external achievement to inner realization, from fitting into society to becoming authentically oneself. This shift requires temporary withdrawal from social expectations to discover what lies beneath all conditioning. The length of this withdrawal varies enormously from person to person. Some individuals need months of solitude to integrate their awakening. Others require years of minimal social engagement while they reconstruct their entire approach to living. A few might need decades to fully embody their authentic nature without compromise. Jung's warning about the disappearing spiritually awake isn't a prediction of permanent exile from society. It's recognition of a necessary metamorphosis happening in our time. These individuals aren't abandoning the world. They're preparing to serve it from a place of authentic consciousness rather than unconscious conformity. Their temporary withdrawal creates space for genuine transformation that might ultimately help heal the collective struggles they once felt compelled to flee. If you recognize yourself in this pattern, remember it's not disappearance, it's evolution.